The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was meant to ensure lasting peace after the devastation of World War I. Instead, it sowed the seeds of future conflict. The treaty, harsh and punitive towards Germany, imposed crippling reparations, stripped away territory, and limited its military. This fueled resentment and instability in Germany, creating fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take root. The German people, burdened by economic hardship and national humiliation, yearned for a return to strength and a restoration of their pride. The stage was set for a charismatic leader to exploit their grievances and offer a path to redemption. The victors of World War I, Britain, France, and the United States, emerged from the conflict weary and eager to avoid further bloodshed. Their focus shifted inwards towards domestic issues, neglecting the growing storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, proved toothless and ineffective in the face of rising aggression. Its inability to enforce collective security undermined its legitimacy and emboldened those who sought to challenge the existing world order. The world, still reeling from the horrors of the Great War, seemed blind to the gathering storm. The scars of war ran deep, not just in Germany, but across Europe. The continent, devastated by years of fighting, faced the daunting task of rebuilding shattered economies and societies. The loss of an entire generation cast a long shadow, and the psychological wounds of war festered. The fragile peace, built on shaky foundations, could not withstand the rising tide of nationalism, economic turmoil, and political extremism that swept across Europe in the 1920s and 30s. The world, desperate for stability, clung to the hope that peace would prevail. However, the seeds of discord, sown by the Treaty of Versailles, had taken root. The stage was set for a new generation of leaders, driven by ambition and fueled by the grievances of the past, to plunge the world into another global conflict. The gathering storm, ignored by some and underestimated by others, was about to break. The world, still haunted by the ghosts of the Great War, would soon face an even greater test. In the aftermath of World War I, as Europe struggled to rebuild, a new threat emerged from the ashes: the rise of totalitarian regimes. In Italy, Benito Mussolini, a charismatic orator, exploited economic hardship and political instability to establish a fascist dictatorship. Mussolini's message of national revival, promising a return to Roman glory, resonated with a population disillusioned by the perceived failures of liberal democracy. His black shirts, a paramilitary force, terrorized opponents and secured his grip on power. Meanwhile, in Germany, a wounded nation grappled with the humiliation of defeat and the crippling burden of reparations. It was in this climate of despair that Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party found fertile ground for their poisonous ideology. Hitler, a master propagandist, preyed on the anxieties and resentments of the German people. He offered them scapegoats for their suffering, blaming Jews, communists, and the Treaty of Versailles for Germany's misfortunes. His promises of national rebirth and a return to greatness struck a chord with a population desperate for a strong leader. Hitler's rise to power was swift and ruthless. He exploited democratic processes to gain legitimacy, becoming Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Once in power, he systematically dismantled democratic institutions, replacing them with a totalitarian state where dissent was crushed and opposition silenced. The Nazi regime, with its chilling ideology of racial purity and Aryan supremacy, posed a grave threat to the peace of Europe and the world. As Hitler consolidated his power in Germany, Mussolini continued his expansionist ambitions in Africa. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, a brutal campaign that exposed the impotence of the League of Nations and further emboldened the dictators. The world watched with growing alarm as the forces of darkness gathered strength, casting a long shadow over Europe. While Europe grappled with the rise of fascism, a similar storm was brewing in the East. Japan, a nation with a long history of militarism and expansionist ambitions, sought to establish dominance in Asia. Driven by a desire for resources and fueled by an ultra-nationalist ideology, Japan embarked on a path of aggression that would have devastating consequences for the region and the world. In 1931, Japan, using a fabricated incident as a pretext, invaded Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeastern China. This blatant act of aggression met with weak international condemnation, emboldening Japan to continue its expansionist policies. The League of Nations, hampered by internal divisions and a lack of resolve, proved ineffective in reining in Japan's ambitions. This failure would have profound consequences, signaling to aggressors that the international community was unwilling or unable to enforce its own rules. Japan's aggression in China escalated in 1937 with the full-scale invasion of the country. The invasion, marked by horrific atrocities against Chinese civilians, plunged the region into a brutal war. Japan's military expansionism, driven by a belief in its own racial superiority and a desire for imperial conquest, threatened to destabilize the entire Asia-Pacific region. The world, preoccupied with the crisis in Europe, paid insufficient attention to the growing threat posed by Japan. This neglect would have dire consequences, as Japan's ambitions eventually drew the United States into the conflict, transforming a regional war into a global conflagration. The world was on the brink of a catastrophe, and the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, threatening to engulf the entire planet in darkness. Section 4. A Continent in Shadow, Appeasement and Its Price. As the 1930s progressed, Europe watched with growing apprehension as Hitler's Germany became increasingly belligerent. The Nazi regime, emboldened by the lack of a resolute response to its earlier transgressions, began to openly flout the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler, driven by a toxic mix of ideology and ambition, set his sights on expanding German territory and power, posing a direct threat to the fragile peace of Europe. In the face of this growing threat, Britain and France, the guarantors of the post-World War I order, adopted a policy of appeasement. Driven by a desire to avoid another devastating war and haunted by the horrors of the trenches, they sought to accommodate Hitler's demands in the hope of satiating his appetite for conquest. This policy, based on a miscalculation of Hitler's true intentions, would prove to be a catastrophic blunder. The most infamous example of appeasement came in 1938 with the Munich Agreement. In a desperate attempt to avert war, Britain and France agreed to cede the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a predominantly German population, to Germany. This act of appeasement, though celebrated at the time as a victory for peace, only served to embolden Hitler, confirming his belief that the Western powers lacked the will to oppose him. The Munich Agreement, a symbol of the West's failure to confront aggression, had disastrous consequences. It emboldened Hitler, destroyed what little remained of Czechoslovakia's defenses, and shattered the credibility of the Western powers as guarantors of peace. The policy of appeasement, born out of a desire to avoid war, only served to pave the path to a wider and more devastating conflict.